Think about John chapter 20, we just read verse 29, and then put that alongside another pretty well-known verse, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. For we walk by faith and not by sight. And yet Thomas had faith because of sight. How do those work together? I think it is a weakness in our society of understanding the relationship between faith and sight. And is that because of a lack of teaching? Yes. Is that because of a lack of learning, a lack of interest? Yes. Our society is numbed by self-pleasure and entertainment and work, to the point that these are things that are not talked about. These are things that are not thought about, at least often enough, in our society as a whole, but we can't do anything about them. I can do something about me, you can do something about you. And so this morning I want us to think about the relationship between faith and sight. The fact is that in order to see something and to believe my eyes, I have to trust my eyes. I have to trust my eyes are doing their job. I have to trust, I have to have faith that my mind is sound, so that then I believe the things that I see. So on a very basic level, faith and sight work together and go together. So consider some things that you should know, that I should know, and several of our songs have reminded us of the responsibility of people around us who this morning and yesterday and today are not hearing or thinking about these things. Let's understand so that we can help others to understand the relationship between faith and sight. I'm going to stay here in John chapter 20 to begin, because the example of Thomas is maybe the most obvious, that shows sometimes sight actually contributes to faith, because Thomas did not believe what he did not see, and yet what Jesus says to him there in verse 29 is, now you believe. That word believe is the same word as faith in Mark 16:16 and any other. Faith comes by hearing, all those things. It's the same word. Belief and faith are the same thing. And Jesus says, you believe. In other words, you have faith because you saw. So faith and sight are not enemies of each other. But the rest of the verse tells us that sight is not an essential part of faith. Sight can sometimes help and contribute to faith, but it's not the most essential and important part. It's not as though you cannot have faith if you do not have sight, if you do not see, because Jesus points out, blessed are those who do not see and yet have believed. Which then raises the question, okay, well, then how can you believe in something? It's maybe most obvious. I can believe in something that I see. Well, how can I believe in something that I cannot see? And in verses 30 and 31, which Jacob also read, John there tells us. See, John believed Jesus because of what he saw. John saw the signs. But then John wrote down the signs. For what purpose, does he say? So that you can believe. You see, when we are persuaded that John is telling the truth, well then we don't have to see. We know without seeing what John knew by seeing. And so we both end up in the same place. We both believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, because of the miracles that he did. John believed that because of sight. We believe that because of what we learn. And so we both have faith. Consider these two examples, aside from Thomas and John, some examples where sight can contribute to faith. Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, in our class this morning, we were discussing some of this, some of the people that are described here. But some of the traits of God, sight helps to contribute to our faith of those traits. Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, Paul says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes or traits are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. And then he gives us two examples, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that those who reject God, are without excuse. But because, and I think we've learned this lesson, we learn it every single day, even when we are 2 and 3 years old, that something cannot come from nothing. I think we've all lived long enough to learn that. So because something cannot come from nothing, physical things cannot be responsible for their own existence. You're not responsible for your own existence. You didn't bring yourself, as Bill Cosby once said to his children, I brought you into this world and I'll take you out. In other words, you didn't bring yourself into this world. That you're not responsible for your own existence. And that's true of every physical thing on this earth, isn't it? So how could there be all of the diversity that there is on this earth, and as far as our eye and our telescopes can see, how can that be? How can it exist? It takes great power for all those things to exist. And I don't know what the most powerful example of nature that you have seen or experienced or heard of, a tornado, a hurricane, or the sun, but it takes something of greater power to produce something of power. Something of less power doesn't make something greater. Something that is greater uses that power to make something typically smaller. So when we think about the great power we can observe with our eyes, that tells us, well, there's some greater source of power, greater than what I've seen with my eyes. And that means there has to be some source of that power. And the more that we observe the things of this world, the better we understand there's not just this nebulous globe of power floating out there somewhere. That power is from someone. And that someone is not just powerful, that someone is knowledgeable, that someone is wise. And what Paul tells us here, just that basic understanding tells us of the power of God and of His deity, or the Godhead. Some translations may say His divine nature. The point is, there is someone who has a nature that is different than ours, because the power and the things that we see around us tell us there's a power higher than man. There's an intelligence far exceeding man's. And so Paul's whole point here is that based on what you see, there are some things that you can believe just upon that alone. And therefore the knowledge and the wisdom that the scoffer and the denier, and maybe the most influential in our society, the apathetic, the knowledge and the abilities of those who are apathetic to spiritual things, he says they are without excuse. Because sight can contribute to faith. Then go to 1 Peter chapter 3, an example of a completely different kind, but that demonstrates the same thing of the power of sight upon our faith to actually build and sometimes build faith. 1 Peter chapter 3, I should have put verses 1 and 2. He says, "Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives, which they what? Which they observe." So his point is, in the example, even more so in the context of suffering, he's writing to wives whose lives are difficult because of unbelieving husbands. And he doesn't say, well, just wait and God will change your husband. He says, give him some things to see, and that could contribute to the production of faith in him. Sight could help faith. Now, here he's talking about the marriage relationship, but this principle would be true of anyone, couldn't it? And why is it that some people like these, they do not obey the word? They hear the word, and they don't do what they hear. They don't obey what they do understand. Why do they keep themselves distant from what they already know? And it's different for every individual. No man knows the things of a man except the spirit of the man that's in him. Nobody can explain the heart of someone else. But there are some common reasons that we could probably all think of or observe, or maybe even thinking of ourselves. Sometimes people have grown up hearing true things, but then they see things that are not true. And especially in the days of our youth, that's confusing, to hear one thing and to see another. And so some people, they grow up and They have some of the right ideas, but they need to see it. They need to see it put into action. And they've grown up and not seen that. Other people at times, again, they've maybe heard some right things, but then they've heard some false things. So that creates confusion because these things are contradictory to each other. They can't both be true. So which is true? And sometimes it takes years to work through that. I've even been told on more than one occasion that, again, in the days of some youth and in the time where they have some questions and ask questions, that the people that they asked spiritual questions to, those questions were either ignored or sometimes they were just told, well, just believe. Quit asking questions. Just believe it. But that's what we're learning. That's not what Jesus told Thomas. There is a relationship there. Sometimes people do need to see some things. Now, we don't get to declare what those are. We don't get to say, well, God, I want to be like Thomas, and I'm not going to believe until I see because well, God doesn't give us that choice. But here in 1 Peter 3, he tells the wives, sometimes there are some things that others need to see that can help in faith. Let me give a couple of examples of things that people might grow up seeing and hearing that could be an obstacle to their faith. And so they need to see the opposite. Sometimes they need sight because of what they have heard. Just quoting from a book. It says, thus on the day of judgment, religious, means religious people, will be charged with every act of disobedience. But as St. Philip Neri used to say, they shall be most certain of not having to render an account of the actions performed through obedience. For the sake, tried to be concise here. If you wanted to read the whole context here, his point is, you obey your superiors without question. And if you obey your religious superiors, your religious leaders, and you obey them, but they tell you to do something you shouldn't do that is wrong, well, you won't be judged. You see, they will not have to render an account. They won't be judged for obeying their leaders, their spiritual leaders. So what effect does that have on someone who grows up hearing that? Well, you just do what you're told. And even if the one who tells you to do something, even if they're wrong, well, they'll be judged for that. You won't be judged for that. What kind of an effect would that have on someone who heard that when they were 5, when they were 10, when they were 20? And our society is playing that out in front of us in many instances. Another example. Here's what some people have heard. We take the position that a Christian's sins do not damn his soul. The way a Christian lives, what he says, his character, his conduct, or his attitude towards other people have nothing whatever to do with the salvation of the soul, of his soul. All the sins he may commit. Notice that he is a Christian. There's someone that says all the sins that he may commit, from idolatry to murder, will not make his soul in any more danger. Now, sometimes that's called perseverance of the saints, or once saved, always saved. So that's what has often been taught. It's taught here in Fairbanks and around this world, that a Christian's sins, they do nothing to affect his eternity. And here, at least this author was very plain spoken in explaining it. If that is true, then a Christian can commit idolatry or murder, and if he was once forgiven of his sins, then those sins do not damn his soul on the day of judgment. So what kind of an effect does that have on someone who is taught that and grows up practicing that? Well, if I sinned, well, maybe I shouldn't have, but it's not going to affect my eternity. See, some people need to see. They need to see something different. And so I need to look at my life, and you need to look at your life, because what are people seeing in me? Is my life an obstacle to people? Well, they know what I believe or what I claim to believe, but then they see that my life contradicts that. And so in this case, sight is not helping faith, it's contradicting it. But in Matthew 5, what Jesus' plan is for my life and your life, you are the lights of the world. That's what he wants. That men could observe your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. See, sight and faith are not contradictory to each other. God has a plan by your example, by my example, that those would actually work together. And what people see from me and hear from me and see in you and hear from you, it would be right, it would sit right alongside what they could hear from God and learn from God. No, faith and sight don't contradict each other, at least not all the time. Sometimes sight contributes to faith. At least in the plan of God, it does. On the other hand, it is true that sometimes sight can be deceiving and it can contradict faith when we limit ourselves to sight. And sometimes we still have that saying, the hand is quicker than the eye. So can you always believe what you see is what you see, all that you need to know? Even on a basic level, any magician can tell you that's not the case. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. We read from chapter 5, verse 7 a moment ago. Pretty well-known statement by Paul. We walk by faith, not by sight. And hopefully what we're seeing is there's more to it than just that statement. But what Paul means by that, I think, is filled out a little bit here in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 18. He says, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. It's important. What is Paul saying and what is he not saying? We don't look at the things that are seen. Does that mean close your eyes? Don't look at anything around you in the physical world. No. Do you see in this verse, as well as into chapter 5 and verse 7, we walk by faith, not by sight. Paul's telling them that's not our primary guiding director and leader, our eyeballs, our sight, the things that we can see. Yes, they can help us. Other verses, they helped Thomas, but Thomas was not for his primary guidance following his eyes. He'd been following Jesus for 2.5 years. God was. Thomas was wrestling with his unbelief, but he grew in faith. But what we see cannot be our primary guiding principle in life. And if we do claim that, if we claim to live by sight alone, then we're going to be deceived in a whole host of ways. I'll give a few examples in a moment. But look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Before I give those examples, just realize that if I, as many people in our society do, claim, well, I'm only going to believe what I can see with my eyes. Well, then look down the road and think about where that gets you. As Paul said, the things that we see are temporary. And so if my eyes are focused on, if my life revolves around, if my goals primarily involve the things I can see or I can obtain with my eyes and my hands, I'm going to end up with a life of hopelessness. Ecclesiastes 1, verses 2 and 3, vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? And the more you read about Ecclesiastes, that's what Solomon is wrestling with. Well, the things that I can see, ultimately they run out, or I can't get them. I can't have them at all, or I can't have them when I want them. And not Solomon. He got everything that he wanted. And in chapter 2, at least of the things he can see, in chapter 2, read with me verses 14 through 17, after Solomon describes some portion of his time where he did chase everything that he could see, the things that he wanted, and got most, if not all of them, because he had the time and he had the money to get everything that he wanted, that he could see. He says in verse 14, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same thing happens to them all. In class this morning, we were discussing things that happen to some and not to others, the lust of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. But here, there's something that Solomon says he realized happens to the wise and to the fool. What would that be? Keep reading. So I said in my heart, he was bothered by this. As it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. Why was I then more wise? And I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. What does the wise and the fool have in common? For how does the wise man die? This is almost like a joke, like a riddle. You could ask someone, hey, how does a wise man die? What's the punchline? As the fool. And so if my life is focused on the things that I can see primarily or exclusively, what a hopeless life. Because I'm going to end up without all the things that I see at the moment of my death. And then what do I have? And so sight alone is deceiving, and it contradicts faith. Moses, by faith, was able to refuse to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he saw through the passing pleasures of sin. He recognized them for what they were, and so he kept his eyes on the reward. But the passing pleasures of sin, to people who are focused on them, because they're evident, they're obvious, the benefits and the pleasure of them, and that's my guiding principle. I can see some of what I'm going to get, but not everything, because there's nothing that I can see that convinces me, well, there are eternal consequences to the pleasures of sin. Some people might have enough foresight to recognize the pleasures of sin are passing, although most of the time not. Most of the time they're pleasurable. That's as far as I'm going to think, or that's just as far as I'm going to think. But what's going to tell me, what's going to teach me, what's going to impress upon me, there are eternal consequences to my temporary pleasure if it's a sinful pleasure. By sight, there's no way to know that. And in fact, some people live, and by sight, they get away with it. In other words, there are no immediate visible consequences to their sin. And so Paul tells Timothy, 1 Timothy 5, verse 24, some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment. They know it, and everybody knows it, and they suffer in this life for it. But those of some follow later. The sins of some are not evident. They're not known. Those in law enforcement know they can catch a lot of them, but can't catch everybody all the time. Some men's sins do not precede them to judgment. Those sins are not known, at least by everyone else, until the day of judgment. Well, by sight, they lived and they got away with it, and then they died, and were they better off or worse off for it? Well, some would say they were better off for it. They got what they wanted, the pleasure, and they didn't get the pain and the punishment. Well, they will on the day of judgment before God, but by sight, you can't have any concept or awareness of that. And so, if I narrow myself into only the things that I can see, then I'll be deceived. Remember, Jesus said there sometimes are wolves, but by sight, in the moment, you don't know they're a wolf. Why? Because they threw a wool blanket over top. They look like a sheep. And so by sight, I can't distinguish the wolf from the sheep. But by faith, in verse 16, Jesus says, but a good tree bears good fruit, a bad tree bears bad fruit, uses a different example. In other words, if you look long enough, and if you have God's help with the truth, eventually you'll be able to see that wolf tail sticking out beyond the little stub of the sheep tail. By faith, God will allow us to see the difference in truth and error. And then we've got a decision, then we have a decision to make. And so someone says, well, you just obey your superiors. You obey the religious leaders. Whatever they say, you obey. And if they tell you to do something wrong, don't worry. You're okay, they're not okay. Well, the people saying that, they can say lots of true things. And so for a time, by sight, they are indistinguishable from the truth teller, the truth teacher. Well, a Christian sins won't send him to hell. Well, there can be lots of other things said by someone saying that are true, and so that can be deceptive. And so I need faith working together with sight. One more area in the relationship of faith and sight, and this may overlap with some of what I just said, but sometimes it isn't that sight and faith are contradictory to each other. It's just that by sight, I'm only getting part of the picture. And so my understanding is simply limited because I'm not considering everything that's available. And so faith would just give me a better understanding. I might, by sight, understand some, but then I could understand more if faith accompanies my sight and if sight accompanies my faith. I want to spend a few minutes because this is constant in our society, and especially in the teaching and the influence of our children, but not limited to them. But in the areas of, well, how old is the earth? Is it a young earth, an old earth, a young universe, an ancient universe? What about dinosaurs? Those kinds of questions. These questions cannot be totally answered by sight, by instrument, by observation, by study alone. Not throw all that out. We can get some knowledge about the age of our universe and of our earth and of animals and such, but we cannot completely understand those things by sight alone. Even that would have been true with Adam and Eve. Think about there on the sixth day. God creates Adam, God creates Eve. As he looks at her, she looks at him, or if we were able to get a video recording of that and look back at them, well, on the sixth day, how old were they? Less than a day old. But by sight, how old would they have appeared to be? I don't know, but more than a day old. So by sight alone, they would not have been able to accurately judge each other or the trees around them or the animals around them. How could Adam and Eve know how old the other was? Well, they would have to ask God. Eve would have to ask God, well, God, how long has he been around here? God could have said, well, I created him earlier in this day. Well, God, how old is that? If the animals were all made mature, I assume they were, or tall trees. Well, God, how long have those been around here? God would have said, well, could have said, I made those a couple days ago. Oh, wow. In the course of time, they would have learned, well, those things grow slowly. There's an exception to that rule. By sight alone, they couldn't have understood completely the nature of the world around them. And of course, there's nothing living today that was made on that original week of creation. Could we find some rock or some crystal that God created? I don't know. We might could, but if we did, could we judge accurately exactly how long that had been in existence? We couldn't by sight. And so, again, there are some questions that can never be answered by sight alone. And there was a time, and there still is to some degree, where scientific leaders and others, that they gave more consideration to what God said, and they could trust that and what they could observe as they studied and learned. But most of the time today, those who are most influential in those areas of science are people who disregard what God has said. These are the people writing most of the textbooks used in education, whether it's public, private, homeschool, not picking out on one of those, because everybody has a book wherever they study and learn. And the publishers, the authors, and those putting out those books, they're learning some things by sight, but they are ignoring the only eyewitness to all of these things. And doesn't the eyewitness, that's the way things go in a court. We've got some tangible evidence, but then the smoking gun can't totally speak. We have some eyewitnesses. Let's put all of the testimony, all of the evidence together. Then we can usually get a good idea of exactly what happened. And so those who are leaders in the study of the age of the earth, geologists and others, typically, again, there's some exceptions to that, but typically they ignore the eyewitness testimony of God about what happened in the beginning. So then, when they dig in and dig down and look at a rock and compare it to where it is in the dirt, Well, by sight, they reach a conclusion that's only based on limited information, and they don't give consideration to what God has said. He was the one who made it. Likewise, in biology, leaders in the field of biology ignore information that's available about the origin of life. In the beginning, God made them male and female, and the birds and all of those things. And then, in addition to what they can learn and observe under a microscope, then they ignore what God has said. And then additionally, they include ideas by faith. They include ideas they have not observed that contradict what they can observe, like life doesn't come from non-life and physical things. So that there are those who accept or welcome or consider that idea. Well, maybe life does come from non-life. I was asked that before. How do you know it doesn't? And so that's happening in our scientific world among many scientific leaders. They're ignoring what the eyewitness to creation says about life. They're leaving that out. They're learning some things by sight and observation, but then by faith, not in God, but another kind of faith, they're accepting ideas that don't have any evidence. So of course they're going to reach flawed, foolish conclusions like, well, you can pick your gender, or a single cell could eventually produce all the plants, all the animals, all the people on the face of this earth. How do they get there? Well, even with the best of intentions, if they ignore what God says, then of course they're going to end up with the wrong conclusion. And then it's important for us to know that not many of these people are not just trying to learn for the sake of learning because they're interested, they're curious, and they want to know. Many times they want their conclusion in your head, and they want it in your children. And so they'll try the field of education, they'll try the field of entertainment to get it there, they'll try various means of advertising and social media, and I'm sure in more ways than I can be aware of. But they will find every means that they can to get their ideas and their conclusions into you. And if they can't get them into you, it can be easier to get them into your children. And that is obviously happening today. So by faith, I may not know the date of creation, or the day of the universe or our earth, but what we do know helps us to rule out some things. Sometimes I may not know the answer, I may not know what it is, but I can rule out, I know what it isn't. So what God has said helps us to do that. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It wasn't until the fourth day, and light, but it wasn't until the fourth day that the sun, moon, and stars were made. So which came first, the earth or the sun? Genesis 1 tells us the earth existed before the sun did. I would be surprised if there is a textbook. My recollection and observation is what's commonly taught today is that the sun came first and then the earth came after that. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the accepted position today. So how do I know that is not true? Not by my own observation or study or profession, but because the eyewitness told me the earth came before the sun did. So, when you hear, or your children hear, ideas that are based on the idea that the sun came before the earth, well, whatever follows that conclusion, 99.9% of the time is going to be wrong. Even though people telling them may have a PhD and be far more knowledgeable and intelligent than I am, they may know more than I do, but I know something that either they don't know or they don't want to know. So can I answer every question about the age of the universe? No, but I can narrow down what I know by saying, well, I know the earth was made before the sun. That helps me to rule some things out. Or as we read through Genesis 1, how God created life, made the creeping things and the birds, and then made the beasts of the field, and made man. So all life was created within a 2 or 3 day period. Well, of course, the accepted idea in our society today is, well, that happened over the course of millions or hundreds of thousands of years. So can some expert in some field ask me some question I can't answer? Yes. But are there some answers I know are not true? Yes. As long as I remember who was there and what he said, that all life, human, animal, and plant, came into existence within a few hours of each other, within a few days of each other. And so any conclusion or dating system or method that contradicts that, there's a flaw there. There's a problem there. I don't always know. Is it intentional and is it an agenda? Or is it just a mistake? I don't know, but I know the conclusion is wrong because I know all life began around the same time. And then related to that, one other example, Jesus said in Matthew 19 and verse 4, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female?" Was man made at the beginning, or hundreds and thousands or millions or billions of years after the beginning? That's the accepted theory in our society. We had billions of years ago, the beginning of the universe, billions of years ago, or millions, our solar system, and then all the macroevolution, and eventually you get man. Well, lots of things I don't know about what happened in the past, but here's something I do know that rules out a whole lot of what is taught and being taught today. I know that God made them, and I may not be able to assign a number to it, but God made them at the beginning. And so in all these cases, doesn't mean, well, don't study. In fact, I believe we would probably know a whole lot more about the history of man and this earth and the universe if the professionals in our society would use all of the information that's available to them. So I can't answer every question, but I can rule out some answers. And so can you. And part of our job is to do that and to prepare and to teach our children to do that as well, with the understanding that experts today are often ignorant of or just refuse and reject what they can know. Just some other examples. I'm not going to go into that same detail, but that sight can be incomplete sometimes and requires faith to have a better understanding. Well, when I consider my circumstances, or things are going well maybe, I'm getting some things that I want, that I hope for, was that because I'm faithful to God, or is that actually in spite of my faith? Can I always judge my circumstances as being indicative of my spiritual condition? If things are going well, that's because I'm faithful to God. If things are not going well, it's because I'm unfaithful to God. No. My sight needs some faith, because good things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people, and bad things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. So how do I know? Well, I can't judge it by sight. I need to go to God to assess my circumstances. The nature of life and death is like that. What's the definition of life? What's the definition of death? Go look around a little bit, or ask some experts, and you might be surprised that experts admit we don't really have a good definition of life and of death. I've been surprised. I read a little bit, have done that in the past to see, well, what would they say? And they admit, we have the phrase clinically dead, but that clinically is a qualifier because the medical community admits, well, 99.9% of the times, under these conditions, someone is dead, but there have been exceptions to that, where we thought they were dead, and then they were put in the freezer, and they weren't dead. That's happened. So science, in other words, by sight, the experts admit we don't really know what death is or what life is. But you do. You know what death is. In physical terms, the body without the what? The spirit is dead. I can know about the body by sight, but I don't know anything about the spirit by sight. I need faith. I need to hear and accept what God has said. So you and I have a better understanding of life and death than all the PhDs and the experts who ignore what God has said, because they don't consider the spirit. So they can't understand it. And this is one of the few occasions where most of the time, from what I can tell, they admit they don't understand it. What is life in physical terms? It's the body and the spirit in human terms. What is death? It's the body without the spirit. We need sight and we need faith. And then last, who is a good person? People who say, well, in the Bible, I don't really take it literally to be true, but follow the principles and you'll have a pretty good life. You're a good person if you open the door for a stranger and somebody stuck on the side of the road. That's a good person. Well, by sight, but all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So I can't identify a good person by sight, as God would judge that. I need some observation, but there are also some things that cannot be observed. And God observes the heart, and God knows the heart. So just another example that demonstrates the same principle. In many areas of life, faith doesn't dismiss sight. They work together, and we have a more full understanding. So I think sometimes Paul's statement, we walk by faith, not by sight, has been overstated and not really considering what Paul was stating there. And many unbelievers think that, well, faith is blind. Well, no, in reality, faith and sight work together. God is the one who made light. God is the one who gave us the sense that we call sight. And when people elevate their senses, elevate themselves, I'm only going to trust what I can see, well, then they make a god of themselves. Where did that come from? And so God allows us to have this understanding and then to consider, well, what are the things I can learn by sight? I don't need to close my eyes. What am I doing? What am I learning by sight? At the same time, what about faith? I don't need to only have my eyes open in the sense of only considering the things I can only see. What role is faith playing in my life, in my decisions, in my priorities, in my commitments? We're going to sing this song to urge you to ask yourselves those questions. What is the role of sight and what's the role of faith? Because the combination of the two lead us to the knowledge that there is a God and that God has spoken and He sent His Son because I have sinned and because you have sinned, but to provide a way by which God could be just and the justifier, that He could show justice and could also forgive us. Jesus gave His life and Jesus rose from the dead so that you could be forgiven of your sin. And He offers that to you if you'll confess your own faith and you'll repent of your sins. And when you're baptized, the Bible says you'll be baptized into His death. You'll be baptized into your own death, the death of the old man. And it's the blood of Christ that washes away your sins. If you are ready to accept that offer of God, or you need to return to Him by faith and by sight, you know that you're separated from Him. If we can help you and encourage you and stir you up to live the life that you once promised God that you would, tell us how we could serve you as we stand and sing.